Metroidvania are a fairly common genre of games, the genre named, if you couldn't guess, after Nintendo's Metroid brand of 2D exploratory platformers, and many of Castlevania's later games, starting around the time of Symphony of the Night. For the uninitiated, Metroidvania games tend to be 2D platformers with a distinct focus on exploring a large map and utilizing upgrades and abilities picked up through said exploration to be able to progress the story or find hidden secrets that you couldn't access yet. Enter Timespinner, an action platformer pretty firmly within the Metroidvania genre and very much inspired by the aforementioned Castlevania Symphony of the Night. In fact, that's basically where almost the entirety of said inspiration comes from, and if you've ever played Symphony, it's an uncanny level of derivative, from the bosses to the abilities. The protagonist even has a completely pointless backdash, just like Alucard did in Symphony. The art style consists entirely of beautiful sprites layered quite expertly. It's a visually stunning game and a sea of titles with shrug-worthy 3D models. There's some inspiration there from other games, thank goodness, and I got the distinct impression that whoever did the sprites took a lot of cues from the Mana series of games and maybe a tiny bit from the OG Final Fantasy Tactics. If anything, the art is probably the best part of the game, which is a wonder to look at. The music is a close second place. For the most part, the game's tracks fit exactly where they were placed and help the game be more immersive as a result. It's a challenge for me to actually like some of the music in games to the point where I'm not turning it off in favor of my own tracks, but I found myself keeping Timespinner's music on the entire time, which is the highest award I can possibly give a game's soundtrack. This is probably also helped by the game's gameplay and level design, which were, for the most part, top-notch. Each area wasn't especially big, which seems initially like it might be a negative, but it keeps the game from being a slog by treating your eyes, ears, and thumbs to something new and interesting constantly as the game progresses. The controls are spot on, and the gameplay is some of the most fluid I've ever seen in the genre. The fast travel system was almost perfect, but my only gripe was that the game fails to inform you when you can time travel using the fast travel system, which can lead to considerable confusion. Of course, not every game is perfect, and there's some visible flaws in what should have been a shiny diamond. For starters, the game's story is decidedly subpar, and the motivations of the characters are somewhat confusing. Even though the game offers you a ton of context, it is sadly just no real help. There's also an overabundance of LGBT representation in the game, and I'm sure saying so will earn me some flack, but it needs to be said regardless, or I'm a failure as a critic. It's understandable that the LGBT community is eager to have representation in games, and that's normally fine for me, I don't typically care, but very little of it is important to the overarching narrative, and it felt as though the game were trying to make it that way. It made me wonder if it was all added to be inclusive just for the sake of being inclusive. A lot of it's laid on pretty thick, especially if you pursue the game's several side quests, and even when the game tries to be subtle about it, it's about as subtle as a building demolition. Beyond that, mobility options are strangely lacking in this game. The game does offer a double jump, and there's a quick backdash that's too laggy to be useful, but beyond that, I haven't discovered anything else in my gameplay. I often found myself wishing that the game had taken a little more from action platformers like Mega Man X and added a dash ability. I think if it had been added before fast travel became prominent, it would have made exploring and fighting bosses much more enjoyable. It made me wonder if this sort of thing was an oversight or if it was deliberate, but I assume it was deliberate because the devs clearly wanted the game to be more faithful to Symphony of the Night than any other possible action platformer. But even Symphony and Super Metroid, the fathers of the genre, had abilities that allowed you to move quickly. Hell, even Super Metroid let you sprint out the gate, and I think that if the developers had cherry-picked some of the best things from other games in the genre, it would have benefited Timespinner in the long run. Ironically, Timespinner noticeably attempts to set itself apart from the game it's closely imitating by having more of a narrative, with greater context, story, and more of a focus on characters and their relationships with one another, but it feels poorly planned and executed. And I really hate to say it, since the developers clearly put a lot of time, energy, and passion into the game, but I think their failures here are because Symphony had no baseline for the developers to follow here, and no real experience with it themselves, and so it fell completely flat. One thing that makes Metroidvania games what they are is the presence of minimal story. Super Metroid has an intro sequence that takes maybe 30 seconds to a minute, and then the game lays out Samus's motivations and then lets you free. After that, there's just very, very little story. Symphony of the Night has more in the way of a story compared to Super Metroid, but nowhere close to Timespinner. Hell, it's frustrating to think that several people within the team have probably played Metroid Fusion, a game that was heavy on story for a Metroid game, and likely understood that Metroid Fusion was shit on after release and for decades after, because the game was too story heavy for a Metroid game. It's a pretty obvious lesson, yet clearly not learned by anyone working on the game's development. It's just truly baffling. At any rate, if you look past the mediocre story, which isn't necessarily a challenge to do if you dodge most of the game's boring side quests, Timespinner is a fun as hell game to play and totally worth sitting down to if you get a chance. The developers truly understood the game they set out to emulate in, well, most ways, and it shows in the art, controls, and gameplay. Timespinner is normally $20, but can sometimes be found on sale for as low as $8, both of which are worth the price of admission, in my opinion. Thanks for hanging out today. If you want more Chunky Beef, be sure to subscribe or follow us on Twitter, links in the description below. See you soon.